Ladies and gentlemen, President Bill Clinton, Governor Kathleen Sebelius, and the Platform Party.
Y'all can go. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah. How we go?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. And welcome to the 148th Landon Lecture on Public Affairs. The Landon Lectures were started in 1966 by the late Governor Alf Landon and the late K-State President James McCain. The goal of the Landon Lectures is to bring the most prominent public figures to Kansas State University to discuss the pressing issues of the day. We are very pleased today to welcome President Bill Clinton to the Landon podium to join 147 predecessors in bringing his thoughts and opinions on important public issues. I think we're pretty happy that he's here today, aren't you? Huh? Before introducing members of the Platform Party, I would like to introduce some distinguished guests in the audience. Congressman Jerry Moran, where is he? There he is right there. Thank you very much. Congressman Dennis Moore. Lieutenant Governor Mark Parkinson. And Mr. President, a former governor of Kansas for 8 years and now a political science professor here at K-State, John Carlin. John, thank you very much. Our chairman of the Kansas Board of Regents, Nelson Galley. Nelson, thank you. Regent Dan Likens. There he is. Regent Janie Perkins. Thank you for coming. And we're very happy to have the president of Fort Hays State University here today, Ed Hammond. Ed, there he is over there. And Mr. President, as you can imagine, we have quite a few members of the Kansas House of Representatives and the Kansas State Senate here today. Please give them a welcome as well. Thank you very much. Now, for members of the Platform Party, on my left, Professor Roger Adams, Rare Books Librarian and President of our esteemed Faculty Senate. Right there. Then next to him, a rising star in Kansas and American politics, a senior in agricultural technology management, and the president of our K-State student body, Lucas Maddie. And then on my right, Edward Seaton, chairman of the Landon Patrons and editor-in-chief and publisher of the Manhattan Mercury. Thank you. And then next to him, Dr. Charles Reagan, associate to the president and chairman of the Landon Lecture Series. And ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you a great governor for the state of Kansas, Governor Kathleen Sebelius. Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. This is a wonderful and exciting day for Kansas State University and the Landon Lecture Series. During Bill Clinton's presidency, from 1993 to 2001, the American economy enjoyed arguably the greatest period of peace and prosperity in its entire history. It is very difficult to find any 8-year period in American history where the economy increased in strength every single year. The economy was so strong, in fact, that President Clinton was able to propose the first balanced budget in 30 years and to achieve a budget surplus for the first time in years and years. Unemployment was at the lowest point in modern times, and inflation was the lowest in 30 years. It was indeed a remarkable period in American history for our economy. Well, I know many of you understand President Clinton graduated from Georgetown University. There you go. And in 1968, he won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University. Well, President Clinton, you need to know that among 500 public universities, K-State is second in our students winning the Rhodes Scholarship in the past 20 years. Now, I got to tell you this. Indeed, K-State students have won more Rhodes, Marshall's, Truman's, Goldwater's, and Udall scholarships than any public university in the United States of America. After studying at Oxford, Bill Clinton received a law degree from Yale and entered politics in the state of Arkansas. He served there as Attorney General and was twice elected governor. When President Clinton and Vice President Gore were elected in 1992, for the first time in 12 years, both the White House and Congress were held by the same party. That political edge, however, was brief as Republicans won both houses of the Congress in 1994. 12 years later, the Democrats have retaken both the House and the Senate. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased and thrilled this afternoon to welcome to the K-State Landon Lecture Podium one of America's greatest political speakers of the post-World War II era, President Bill Clinton.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you, Mr. President. I always like being on platforms with presidents who aren't term limited. You know, apparently C-SPAN is covering this, and did you notice how he used that introduction to shamelessly flack for K-State? Was it great? And I expect, you know, Monday morning there'll be another 5,000 young people here demanding open admission right away. I thank you for having me here. Governor, I'm delighted to see you again. We first met nearly 20 years ago when we were in different positions. And I flew home and told my wife after I met you that I had met, I thought, one of the most gifted natural politicians I had met in many a day. And I waited a while, but you have certainly proved my prognosis right. And thank you for your outstanding service. I'd like to thank the others on the platform, Mr. Seaton, Director Reagan, Faculty President Adams. I learned that Mr. Mattey's sister is the elected vice president of the student body, and I was glad that you didn't have an anti-nepotism law that interferes with the will of the popular will of the students here. And whatever their parents raised them on, we need to find it and give it to all the non-voters in America. That was very, very impressive. Thank you for your service. I want to thank my old friend, Representative Moore and Representative Moran. Thank you both for coming so much. And John Carlin and I served as governors together 100 years ago. And as you see, he looks younger than I do now. His mummifying process is working better than mine is. We had a great time, and then he was the National Archivist, caring for our country's most important records when I was president, and he stayed on under President Bush when I left. So thank you for a lifetime of friendship and for your service to Kansas and to America. In their absence, I want to mention three other Kansans. First of all, your former Congressman Dan Glickman, who was my Secretary of Agriculture and did a great job in that position. And secondly, former Senators Dole and Kassebaum. I went to Bob Dole's center to give a speech for him, and you know, we do a few things together. After 9/11, we raised $110 million to guarantee college scholarships to the children and spouses of all the people killed or disabled on 9/11 from all over the world, not just the Americans, everybody who was. And I loved him, but in his droll way, when I was there, I said, "Bob, I'm having a good time." He said, "Yeah," but he says, "You know how Kansas works." He says, "Now you got to go to K-State." He said, "Nancy will get to check that box." And Senator Kassebaum invited me many years, and this is the first time I've been able to come, so I'm delighted to be here. And particularly honored by the presence of the men and women in uniform from Fort Riley and Fort Leavenworth over here. Let's give them a hand. You all stand up. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you. I will get back to them in a moment, but for all the students here especially, here's the deal. What we're supposed to do, as I understand it, is I'm supposed to say something halfway profound, and then you're supposed to ask questions about it. And I'm going to take you on a trip through my mind, sort of. It might be scary. To try to help you make up your mind about various things. 41 years ago, when Alf Landon gave the first Landon series lecture, The title of the lecture was New Challenges in International Relations. In shorthand, the title of what I'm about to say to you, in part at least, is why there's no dividing line anymore between international and domestic relations. And if you're a Kansas farmer worried about the price of wheat, you know that in one level. If you're a K-State student and you spend half your time on the internet, you know it at another level. If you, as I and my wife did, if you know anybody who was on one of those airplanes or in those office buildings on 9/11, you know it at another level. If you saw what happened to the stock market in America this week after it dropped in China, you know it in another way. So the first thing I want to say is I'm here in the heartland of the country with a bunch of people who are far more connected to the world beyond America's borders than students would have been 41 years ago on either coast. So what I want to talk about today in my remarks before we get to questions is, how are you supposed to think about this world? I believe that every concerned citizen, without regard to party or region or whether you think you're more conservative or more liberal, everybody needs some sort of a framework within which you can evaluate all these issues that are happening all the time, and where you can sort out the ones that don't amount to much. Half the stuff that makes the headlines every day, you know instinctively, are just fleeting dross. They don't amount to anything. And then some things represent trend lines. They reflect things that show big underlying sweeping changes in society. And you need to be able to have a framework with which you use to think about all this stuff. Otherwise, when you look at the news or read the paper or scroll up on the internet the day's events, it looks like the political equivalent of chaos theory in physics. Looks like just a bunch of stuff unrelated, and how are you supposed to remember it all and figure out how to evaluate it? Now, the way I do it, the process that I arrived at, was to ask and answer 5 simple questions. And I think every one of you needs to be able to answer the same questions. Even though I'm not running for anything, I'm still enough of a politician to hope you'd give the same answers I would, but I know you won't. Not all of you. It's not nearly as important that your answer is the same as mine, it's that you have an answer. But if you can answer these 5 questions, then you'll be able to think about where America and the world are going, what you ought to do, how you fit into the larger stream of events, and what your responsibilities are, not only to your family and your community, but to the future as it unfolds. So here they are. Question number 1. What is the fundamental nature of the 21st century world? In a word. Most people would say globalization. I prefer interdependence. I prefer interdependence for 2 reasons. Number 1, globalization to most of us is an economic term. This goes way beyond economics. Before World War I, the world was about as the rich countries of the world were as tied together economically as they are today by trade. But now there's more money movement, but there's far more information technology movement, more travel, much more interchange going way beyond economics. And number 2, there is more internal diversity in America and in all other rich countries than there used to be, as people flock to centers of opportunity seeking a better tomorrow. I just looked through this crowd and I bet it's more diverse by race, by religion, even by gender than it would have been if we'd had a meeting here 40 years ago. So I like the term interdependence. Question number 2. Is it a good or a bad thing that we're living in an age of global interdependence? My answer is both. I mean, it's self-evidently good for most of us, right? And we're in reasonably decent clothes, and we know how to log on to the internet, and we'll probably get to take a trip or two in our lives, and we meet people who are from different places and different backgrounds, and we learn things and see things and do things, and we are empowered in a way by our being connected to this global economy. But it doesn't really work today for about half the people. Half the world's people live on less than $2 a day. 1 billion people live on less than $1 a day. 1 billion people will go to bed hungry every night. 1 billion people have no access to clean water. 2.5 billion people have no access to sanitation. 1 in 4 of all the people who perish on Earth this year, from the wars, the terrorist incidents, the natural disasters, from cancer, from heart attack, from stroke, from you name it, 1 in 4 of all deaths will come from 4 sources that almost no American will die from: AIDS, TB, malaria, and infections related to dirty water. Cholera, dysentery, diarrhea. 80% in the last category will be children under 5 years of age. So all those people are not very well connected to the rest of the world. And even in the wealthy countries, in most of them, a huge percentage of the people are only peripherally benefited by globalization. If you look at the United States, for example, this process has been going on for more than 30 years. Median, not average. Average includes guys that make a lot of money like me. Median, those in the middle, wages have been more or less flat in America from 1973 through 1996. In my second term, they went up again, and inequality diminished for the first time in 20 years. And then in this decade, they've been flat again. And it's been very unusual in this decade because we've had high rates of economic growth, high rates of worker productivity growth, a 40-year high in corporate profits, and yet you have in the United States median wages flat, the percentage of working families dropping below the poverty level going up, the percentage of working families without health insurance going up by 4%. And you can see that, I'm sure, all over small towns and rural areas in Kansas. You can see it in Arkansas, where I grew up and where my library now is, and you can see it all throughout New York, where I travel a lot now because both my office is there and my wife represents the state and the Senate, so I see all this. So is this good or bad? The answer is both. A lot of people in America were upset when all these kind of left-wing guys started winning public office in Latin America. Evo Morales, the first native Indian in Bolivia, the poorest country in South America, ever elected to his country's presidency. He wasn't married, and his sister served as his first lady, and she had to borrow a dress and take a bus from their little village to the Capitol in order to participate in his inaugural ceremony. And we were all worried because he said he was going to nationalize the mines and all that. And I tell everybody, I said, if you were a 45-year-old Bolivian miner and you had 4 children and your body was old before its time and you thought your kids would never do any better than you, and all you could do for them, no matter how hard you worked, was put a scrap of food on the table at night, you would have voted for Evo Morales. Because he was clearly an honorable man, clearly an intelligent man, clearly a person who just wanted to try to make things work for ordinary people. So that's the second question. Is it good or bad? I think it's both. Third question. How should we try to change this world? I think we should try to move from interdependence, which is good or bad, to integration, to a set of integrated communities, locally, nationally, and globally. All integrated communities, university sports teams, families, businesses, military units, all integrated communities, successful ones, have three things in common. They have shared opportunities to participate, shared responsibilities for the welfare of the whole, and a sense of genuine belonging. That is, if you're part of one, related to all the other members in the unit, you think that your differences are interesting, but your common humanity, your common membership matters more. And this is very, very important. You remember a year or so ago when they had those bombings and the terrorist bombings in London? And the British were shattered by this because unlike 9/11, when the United States was penetrated by terrorists from other countries, the people who pulled off these horrible killings were British citizens who had grown up there, who went to work and lived in neighborhoods and had friendly relations with people at work and in neighborhoods, and people that were interviewed afterward were just stunned because they didn't really belong, did they? The people that strapped those bombs on thought their differences were more important than the common humanity they had shared with people, some of them for decades. Meals, holidays, playing games down the street, the whole 9 yards, and still it did not penetrate them. And a lot of people died because of that. But if you look at the modern world, we have no choice but to try to move from interdependence to integration. Because the world we live in today we can't keep going this way. We can't keep going with half the people left out of it economically. It's unequal. It's also unstable. I think it's highly unlikely that this century, for all of you who are younger than me, which is nearly everybody these days, I think it's highly unlikely that this century will claim as many innocent lives as the 20th century did. You just go back and add up. Sometime when you're feeling really pessimistic about terrorism and really worried about Iraq and Afghanistan and all that, you should be concerned about all this. But go back and look at how many people died in a much smaller world. In World War I, in World War II, in the Soviet Union between the wars, in the Chinese purges, and when Pol Pot took over in Cambodia, a country with only 8 million people, 2 million killed. I think that it's unlikely. On the other hand, unlike the last century, we all feel vulnerable all the time. When the news just broke not very long ago about the terrorist groups in England trying to put an explosive into baby bottles to put it on airplanes, everybody that flies an airplane felt a tingle up and down their spine because it meant we were all feeling vulnerable. And we all feel vulnerable to other things, disease. One of the most interesting things about the news that's changed over the last 10 years is you can now turn on the evening news, and if there has a chicken has been found with avian influenza. Listen to the last few months, I've been watching the news, and I've seen a chicken in Romania, a chicken in India, and a chicken in Indonesia they found with avian influenza. And I can tell you how many square kilometers in those three countries they killed every last chicken to make sure that no bird with avian influenza got out here into the human population. Now we're smiling, but this is a good thing because they recognize there is no known cure, no known vaccine right now for avian influenza in people. And we know that at the end of World War I, in 3 rolling waves, the so-called Spanish influenza, which actually began on an Army base here in Kansas, killed 25 to 50 million people because there was no known antidote to it. So this is an unstable setup. And the third thing I want to say about it is unsustainable because of climate change. And because, in addition to climate change, because of resource depletion. Matthew Simmons, a distinguished petroleum investor who is no liberal Democrat tree hugger like me, he is one of the Bush family's close friends. He's a conservative Republican. He says we have 35 years of recoverable oil left. The Saudis and Exxon say, no, we've probably got 100 years. Now, the oldest city in civilization, according to carbon dating that we know about today, is Jericho in the Middle East, 10,000 years old. That means that the real happy talk people are saying we have 100 years out of 10,000, 1% of the whole history of civilization left to burn oil. In addition to oil, we have serious topsoil erosion around the world, which is going to create food shortages and food refugees. In the last decade, only Argentina and Brazil, which have about 22 feet of topsoil, still the biggest deposits in the world, only Argentina and Brazil in the last decade had significant increases in food yields. America and Canada and the breadbasket of Europe, they held their own. They continued to produce very well, but we didn't have any big breakthroughs. That only happened in those two countries. The world population is supposed to go to 9 billion by the middle of the century, from 6.5 billion a day. How are we going to feed all these people if the soil keeps eroding? You have water quality erosion. You have biodiversity loss. 90% of the major fishing areas of the world are now understocked. So, what we're doing is not sustainable. Good and bad, but unequal, unstable, unsustainable. But if we went to a set of communities, locally, nationally, globally, where we had shared opportunities for participation, shared responsibilities for our common welfare, and a genuine sense of belonging, because our common humanity is more important than our interesting differences, we'd have a chance to overcome all these problems. Okay? Fourth question, how in the world would you do that? These questions get harder as you go along. Well, I could keep you here till tomorrow morning talking about any part of this answer, so I'm going to be very brief to get to the questions. How would you do it? You have to have a security policy. There are people, we need people in uniform like these people. You've got to have a security policy. There are people trying to take us down and destroy the enterprise. But I just read a stunning essay by a young man that I feel that I helped raise, who just retired as a captain in the Marine Corps to pursue the rest of his life. He won the Bronze Star at Fallujah. His unit lost no men in the battles. His Iraqi unit had no deserters that he trained to fight. He was, in other words, a successful American soldier in the Marine Corps. He wrote an essay because for this study he wants to do to go on with the rest of his life, in which he said, we did about as good as you can do over there, and what I think is we can't look to our military solution first. The military can only be effective if we also have a diplomatic solution and if we're over there trying to make friends as well as deal with enemies. And that's, if you look at, he said the kind of, with all the problems in the world, with unstable circumstances and non-state actors like terrorist groups and organized criminals and drug dealers and all this, you always got to have politics at work with military. There will be very few purely military solutions available, no matter how good we are at what we do. And if you look, for example, at this deal the president just made with North Korea, I happen to think it's a pretty good deal. And I was delighted to see it happen, but it was produced by diplomacy. So you need a security strategy, a diplomacy strategy. You need, thirdly, a strategy to make a world with more partners and fewer terrorists. If you remember that whole litany of numbers I gave you showing that half the world is not part of what we are, let me give you some good numbers. Bob Dole wrote a book with George McGovern in the last year or two about how we could end hunger. Guess what? It doesn't cost very much money. We know how to get the 130 million children in the world who don't ever go to school into school, and it doesn't cost very much money. We know how to achieve the so-called millennium development goals to eradicate extreme poverty on Earth by 2015. And it doesn't cost all that much money. And we actually know how to do it now. When I was in my last year as president, we put $300 million into a school feeding program that Senator Dole and Senator McGovern supported. And we increased enrollment in poor countries by offering them a free student lunch or student breakfast, but they had to come to school to get the meal. Enrollment went up with $300 million by $6 million. Cost us $50 a kid to get children in school. How much is it worth if, out of those 6 million kids, 10 of them would have become terrorists? Just 10. We saved money, didn't we? We spent $100 billion in Afghanistan. We spent $400 billion in Iraq. It is irrelevant whether you support or oppose our policies in either of those places. The point I'm trying to make is we've got to have a security strategy, but if you live in an interdependent environment and you can't kill, jail, or occupy all your enemies, you've got to have a strategy to make more partners and fewer enemies too, and it is always, always cheaper than fighting. The health, the education, the development. Now, finally, last question. Who's supposed to do all this? This is the most important question of all. You're reading this, who's supposed to do all this? And the answer is, we all are. Are there things that the government has to do? Absolutely. There are things that need doing that you can't do legally unless you put on a uniform and train properly for it. And you'd be ineffective if you tried. There are policies that cannot really change in America effectively unless the government changes its direction. I'm encouraged that we had, unbelievably, we had Walmart, basically a conservative company, not unionized, and the SEIU, one of the most liberal unions in America, standing together last week calling for universal health care for all Americans, and because SEIU wants it for humanitarian reasons, and Walmart realizes that we're going to go bankrupt if we won't do something about it. It was really interesting. We all have to do something about it. And so that brings me to the second point, which is that in America we have a whole history of citizen action too. And that's what I do now. When I got out of the White House, it was interesting, and my wife went to the Senate. We were like, it's like we changed roles in a play after 30 years. Because for 30 years, she'd been out there doing those things that non-politicians do. Starting advocacy groups for families and children, bringing in preschool programs to Arkansas from Israel, worrying about how we built up health care and education in rural areas, doing all this stuff, not elected to anything. Traipsing over to Beijing to tell people who were oppressing women and kids to quit, all just as a person. And then all of a sudden, I had to do that. And I realized I didn't have a clue. I'll never forget that I was shaving one day in early 2001 after I left the White House, and I looked in the mirror and I said, I have become a non-governmental organization. Who am I? What am I supposed to do? And now I spend lots and lots of time answering that question every day. And I've done a lot of work with people that were otherwise political adversaries of mine. Former President Bush and I, we always had a good relationship, and we've become immensely close, working on the tsunami relief, working on the Katrina relief. And I've developed a good relationship with the current president, and we don't agree on much of anything, but I have a good relationship with him. And when he does something I like, I take up for him. Like something that may not be popular here, he wants to speed food aid to poor countries where people are starving quicker by letting us buy half or 25% of the food in the country next door, which I think is better than requiring that it all be grown in America, even though farmers in Arkansas and Kansas don't like it very much. Your tax dollars would go further and more people would live quicker. So I try to think about all these issues in a different way now. I try to say, I'm a citizen now. What can a citizen do? And let's answer that question. Then you identify everything that's left and you say what has to be done at the state or local or national level, or what can be done by the business community. Identify that question, and sort of, in my mind, I'm passing out assignments every day. And I want you all to think about that, because a big part of building this world, it's the last point I want to make before we open for questions, is what I would call a relentless search for home improvement. I want to end where I began. If Alf Landon were giving the lecture today, I guess he'd be 120 years old almost. But he wouldn't be able to say trends in international relations, because he was a very smart guy. He would talk about how the line between what is international and national, what is local and global, has totally evaporated. And I find I work in a lot of poor countries. I have AIDS projects in 25 countries where we provide the least expensive, high-quality AIDS drugs in the world. We sell them in 62 countries, 540,000 people in the world who are getting AIDS medicine since 2003, getting off these contracts we negotiated. And we work in 25 countries. And I can tell you, I won't go into a country unless the government asks me in and they agree to work with us and we work through them. So if something happens to me, I want to know the system, the healthcare system, is working better. Not just for AIDS, but for TB, for malaria, for maternal and child health, for tropical diseases. I want people to be stronger. If they don't have a good government, there's not much the rest of us can do to help them. Similarly, in America, if half the people in Kansas believe that the world is going darker for them, that they're not part of this new future that's bright, and Dennis Moore, as a representative in Congress, goes out and tries to give a speech in his district about how we should be feeding all these kids in poor countries so we'll get them all in school and then they won't go to madrasas and they won't be radicalized, then people are going to look at him like he's nuts. They're going to say, Dennis, every third storefront in our town is closed. What the heck are you worried about those people for? They can't vote for you. Take care of me. And I guess what I'm trying to tell all of you is, I think we have to take care of us too. But in the end, we can't take full care of America's next generation unless we take care of the world. So I think that I leave you with this thought. I think there are 3 home improvement issues that if we dealt with them, they would dramatically increase our ability to deal with the challenges we face. We can't keep going with the healthcare system we got. We can't. Of all the new members of the House of Representatives that were elected, the one I was closest to, Joe Sestak from Pennsylvania, is a retired 3-star admiral, former commander of the George Washington Battle Carrier Group, from a Catholic family of 7 siblings. And he had 6 in the district and all their relatives. All he had to do was find 10 non-relatives to vote for him, and he got elected. But Sestak ran for Congress in part because he started a family late in life. He was traveling at sea a lot, and his only child got brain cancer. And he was told in all probability that she would die. It has a happy ending, this story. She did not. She recovered. But he didn't know that. So he took early retirement so he could be at his daughter's bedside every single day she still had left on this earth. And he kept meeting all these people who, unlike him, had not been in the military and didn't have a good health insurance policy, whose kids were sick. And he said he just couldn't take it anymore. And it was one of the 3 reasons he cited at every speech for running for the United States Congress. Most overqualified person I used to tell to go to the Congress. The guy ran a carrier battle group. But we got to do something. We can't. We're spending 16% of our income on health care. No other country spends more than 11. That's $800 billion a year we're spending. So if this is supposed to be a state of fiscal conservatives, prudent people. Okay, so if you're going to spend $800 billion more on something than anybody else on earth, surely you're going to get something out of it, right? We insure 84%, nobody else insures fewer than 100%. Our overall health outcomes rating is 37th, although we do rank as high as 34th in life expectancy. What are we paying for? Well, we spend 34% of the healthcare dollar on administration costs from providers and insurers. No one else spends more than 19. That's $300 billion a year that we pay for 2 million Americans to go out and play tug-of-war every day over getting paid for providing healthcare. One side trying to get the money and the other side trying to either keep from paying or hold on as long as you can and earn interest. And the grinding transaction cost is more than enough to insure everybody in the country who doesn't have insurance today. There are other things that we should talk about if we had all day that involve medicine, that involve lifestyle. We have enormous rates of obesity, our diabetes among young people, adult onset diabetes among young people exploding in America. Emory University said that in the 1990s, when I served, 27% of the increase in healthcare costs was caused by diabetes and its consequences: more heart attacks, more strokes, more blindness, more amputations. Well, these members of Congress here will have to spend a lot of your tax money on a Medicaid budget this year. 20% of the Medicaid budget, which cares for poor people, goes to conditions directly related to the explosion of diabetes in America. So there are lots of issues. That's issue number one. Issue number two is the economy. We can't keep having an economy where people like me in the top 1/10 of 1% get more and more and more money every year, and they throw a tax cut at us every year, and middle-class people's wages don't rise. Now, here's what happens. Now, I promised at the very beginning of the talk to come back to this. I would like to tell you that we got inequality down and wages up in my second term because Bob Rubin and I were utter economic geniuses. I'd love to stand here with a straight face and tell you that. We didn't hurt anything. We had good policies. And our policies were directly responsible for moving 100 times as many people from poverty to the middle class in our 8 years as in the previous 12. But the real reason that all the jobs were created is that America had a source of good new jobs in the 1990s, because the jobs in information technology moved out of the dot-com companies and the video game companies in Texas and exploded into every aspect of American life. I could go out, when I was governor of Arkansas, I remember at the very end, I'd go out at harvest season when we were bringing in the rice crop, or I'd go to planting season, and all my farmer friends all of a sudden were in air-conditioned tractor cabs with computers, telling them what to plant and when to plant it and what kind of fertilizer to use, and it was the darndest thing I ever saw. That created millions of jobs. Every workplace in America changed in the 90s. Now, this decade has not seen its source of new jobs. That's the problem. That's when we got flat wages. And yet it is a bird's nest on the ground. If we made a serious commitment to a clean, independent energy future, we would create those jobs in Kansas and across the country. And you do not have to accept my word for this. You can look at the evidence. I'll give you two pieces of evidence. Number one, in Europe, the economies that look most like Americans, that is the ones that are most free market oriented, the most unregulated, are probably the Netherlands, Denmark, and the United Kingdom. In Denmark, unlike America, their unemployment rate's almost identical to ours, but their growth rate is higher, their wages are going up, inequality is going down. Why? In the last few years, the Danish economy has increased in size by 50%. Now, at the same time, estimate how much their energy use has increased and how much their greenhouse gases emissions have increased. Answer, 0. Nothing. 0. No increase in energy use, no increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Their greenhouse gas emissions have gone down while their economy has gone up 50% because they've also decided to generate 22% of their electricity from wind. Let's take the UK, even more like us. When, in my last year as president, when we negotiated 98, we negotiated the Kyoto Climate Change Accord, which calls for all these countries to cut their greenhouse gas emissions down below 1990 levels by 2012. I mean, and Al Gore and a guy named Stu Eisenstadt went to Japan to close this deal for me, and I was signing off on it. They didn't even get off the airplane before the Senate voted against it. The Senate voted against it. Almost 100% of the Republicans and nearly 100% of the Democrats voted against it before I could send it to them, because they said it would bankrupt America if we had to reduce our energy consumption and the poison we were spewing into the air. It would be the end of civilization as we knew it. Then I went out and gave a speech on climate change, and it elicited a giant yawn from all but the most fanatic members of the press on this subject. Now look at what the United Kingdom did. The United Kingdom said something very different. They said, oh, we like the Kyoto Accord. It's a perfectly nice little piece of paper. But the truth is, it's a little bit of a weak sister. They too much compromise. It's too weak. We're going to beat our Kyoto targets by 25 to 50%. Guess what? They did. And their unemployment rate's as low as ours, but their wages are going up and inequality has not gone up, and their growth is high because of all the jobs they created in clean energy. And the British government has actually put out a list by category of how many new jobs they created by beating their Kyoto targets, and they're so excited they're gonna beat them again. I'm telling you, if you look around here, the greatest thing about biofuels of any kind is that they don't travel well. That's good. That means no big long pipelines, and every 50 or 100 or 200 miles, you got to have a new production facility and a new distribution network, and we can revitalize rural America. We can bring back the small towns and the rural areas, and we can do it. And once we get a cost conversion fix on cellulosic ethanol, we can do it without having corn prices so high that all the chicken people and the cattle feeders go out of business and everybody goes crazy. We can do it all in a balanced way here. But it's not just that. It's not just that. My library has 308 solar reflectors. I cut my greenhouse gas emissions 34%. Those things were made in America by Americans. And I could go on and on and on and on. If we made this a commitment, then we would deal with we could deal with health care, deal with the economy, and deal with climate change. And we would give Americans space, emotional space, financial space, to say, okay, go out there with your security policy, your diplomacy, your policy to build more partners and fewer terrorists, and bring the world together. Bring the world together. Give our children the future they deserve. So anyway, that's how I think. If something happens tomorrow, and you want to know how I feel about it, you can already figure out my answer. Because my answer is always determined by this question. Does this or that or the other course of action help or hurt our efforts to build a world with more shared opportunities, shared responsibilities, and genuine sense of belonging? If it helps, I'm for it. If it hurts, I'm against it. And if I don't know, I try to figure it out. That's how I deal with emerging events every day. You may not agree with my analysis, but you should be able to answer those questions. What's the nature of the 21st century world? Is it good or bad? How would you like to change it? What steps are necessary to do that? Who's supposed to do it? Finally, the answer is whether you're in or out of government, you are. Thank you very much.
If you could get the lights up. Well, President Clinton, thank you for a marvelous and excellent Landon lecture. That's all right. Well, I think many of you have attended a Landon lecture before, and so the President's agreed to answer some questions here today. So we're going to have a mic right up here, another one back there, one down on the floor, and then one right up here. So let's start here with number 4. Are there any questions back here at number 4?
That's fine. President Clinton, how do you use diplomacy to try to solve the Middle Eastern, Palestinian, Israeli, Iran-Israel feud when the starting point is Iran's position of we should annihilate Israel?
Well, first of all, I think that dealing with Iran and Syria and the other peripheral parties is somewhat different from the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. We're moving back to the right position there. The Hamas Palestinian government and the Fatah, the party of the late Yasser Arafat and the current president, Mr. Abbas, they have reached a unity government agreement. The Israelis and the Americans say the agreement is not good enough to resume negotiations because Hamas has not explicitly said we are going to say no to terror, yes to negotiations, yes to Israel's right to exist. But they're getting there. This is what happens all the time. That is, whenever two groups have been fighting each other and violence and the killing of innocents has been a part of it, they have to find a way to talk where they tell each other enough that they know they're not going to keep killing each other, but they don't tell their public so much that it looks like they've abandoned their convictions. That's what's going on here. It's a kabuki dance. But the good news is they're dancing. And you've got all the Arab states now wanting to be Israel's new best friend because they're more worried about the rise of Iran and a Shia bloc to their east and destabilization within their own borders. So there's much to hope for there. My own view is that Hamas, they need to find a way simply to say no to terror, yes to negotiations, and as long as they're part of the unity government of President Abbas, he has foreign policy responsibilities, they will honor both those conditions, and they assume that they will obviously have to embrace Israel's existence and support it and have a good relationship with them if they make a peace deal. And if they say something like that, just that explicit, then they still got a little wiggle room for their radicals, but they can all go talk and maybe stave off disaster. With Iran, I think that I agree with Jim Baker and Lee Hamilton's commission. I think that we should be talking to the Iranians because even the Iranians, even some of the conservatives have repudiated President Ahmadinejad's anti-Israel, Holocaust-denying remarks. And I won't keep you here long so we can take more questions, but let me just say to all of you this about Iran. First of all, attacking them is a whole different kettle of fish. There are 3 times as many people as live in Iraq. It's not clear that with an airstrike we could take out whatever incipient nuclear efforts they have, depending on where they are. And it's also not clear that it would be the most effective strategy for this reason. When I was president, Iran had 6 elections, 2 for mayors, 2 for Congress, 2 for president. They were the only country in the entire world that 6 times in a row voted for the most progressive, outward-looking candidate they could vote for by margins of 66 to 70%. The problem with Iran is it's the only country in the world with 2 governments. And under their constitution, their religious council, which represents only 1/3 of the people, controls the funds that go to terrorists, the funds that go to intelligence, the foreign policy funds, and has the power to take candidates off the ballot and strike laws from the books or stop them from being enacted in the first place. So dealing with them is a total headache because you're dealing with two governments. And the government with all the people behind it, they like us and they want a future with us. And the other government won't let them get over all these humps, which means that it requires great care. And the most encouraging thing for you should be, I can't answer your question. We can't make a deal with a government committed to destroying Israel because we have to tell them if they try to do that, we'll destroy them. But the most encouraging thing to you should be that Ahmadinejad has now been rebuked in his extremist statements by a lot of the conservatives. And you should also know the voters in Iran did not vote for him because of this. That is not why he won. He won because they voted 6 times for the progressives, and the conservative bloc stopped them at every turn so that the average voter's life never got better. Ahmadinejad was a good, honest, effective, hardworking, populist mayor of Tehran. The voters' thinking went something like this. Hey, this guy's really religious. They'll stay off his back, and he was a good mayor, and he's promised to give me more of the oil money. I'll put him in there. Maybe he can make our life better because these religious people will stay off his back. That's why he won. He did not win because they want to destroy Israel. So what we have to keep in mind in all of our dealings with Iran is not to forget about where 2/3 of the people are, even if those 2/3 of the people have nothing to do with funding the terrorist operations, the training, and a lot of these other problems we've got. And I still believe, and by the way, let me say something else I agree with. I think the Bush administration has actually done a better job than most people know in imposing these economic sanctions. It is not true that economic sanctions are always ineffective. They're working pretty well with Iran, partly because finally the Russians, the Chinese, and others do not want the Iranians to have a nuclear weapon and set off an arms race in the Middle East. So they're actually working better than people think. Don't give up on the fact that the political system may feel the squeeze from economic sanctions. We may not have to go to war and we may not have a disaster. And my view is, no matter what he says, you need to talk to everybody before you bomb them. I mean, in other words, if you're going to have to fight with somebody, I don't care what you don't have in common with them, you should talk first. You should get caught trying to avoid that. That way, if it happens, people respect you more.
Okay, we'll take a question up here, number 1.
Sir, my name is Major Greg Platt. I'm a Kansas National Guardsman assigned to the Command General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth. Thank you for taking the time to come out and talk with us today. Your lead-in is perfect for my question dealing with international relations and chaos affairs, sir. During 1995, in the late spring, early summer, we made a commitment to send in enough U.S. military commitment to help end the Bosnian crisis. My question is 3 parts, sir. Why then? Why not earlier? Why not later? The second part, in making that decision, who influenced you most? Was it Jacques Chirac? Was it Tony Lake? Was it Richard Holbrooke? Or was it Warren Christopher? Or somebody else entirely? And finally, sir, and most important, how much did NATO Operation Plan 40-104 play a part in your decision to make that formal commitment?
I'll break that down into plain English for you. In 1995, you may remember this, after the slaughter of some 7,000 innocent civilians at Srebrenica, which was basically happened after the Bosnian Civil War had been going on for about 3 years, having produced 250,000 deaths and 2.5 million refugees in a country with roughly a fourth or less the population of Iraq. We finally got the support from our NATO allies to go in to Bosnia and begin bombing them, and it didn't take long before essentially they folded, and then we had a UN mandate to go in with the Russians working with us because they had relationships with the Serbs, to send a lot of troops in and a peacekeeping force, and we never lost a single troop there, not a soldier in the peacekeeping. We did have one man killed by accident when he set off a landmine. But there was no conflict death in Bosnia. So how did I decide to do it, and why didn't I do it before, and why didn't I do it later? I wanted to go into Bosnia. This is very interesting in light of Iraq. I wanted to go into Bosnia in 1993, but I was determined that the Europeans would have to go with us through NATO, because I did not think it was practical for the United States to own Bosnia by doing this on our own. And I didn't think it was responsible for the Europeans to allow a religious and political war to rage on unconstrained in Southeast Europe when they were bragging about how democratic and advanced and humane they all were at the end of the Cold War. They had to help this. I didn't think that we could responsibly go in and do this all by ourselves. So I worked for 2 years until the diplomacy got right, and frankly, those who were against us doing it, in effect threatening Milosevic, they lost our last leg to stand on because of Srebrenica, when 7,000 people were just slaughtered, complete innocence there, by the Bosnians, Serbs, and their allies. So circumstances made it possible for me to go. I decided not to go later because I was in a hurry to get there. Now, that question you ask, however, has some relevance for Iraq and the decisions that all of us are trying to either tell the president to make or make ourselves, and what we expect or don't expect from our own military and from the Iraqis. I think we were fortunate in Bosnia because we, first of all, had much greater force protection. We had bigger penetration in gross numbers with America plus NATO as a percentage of the population than we have in Iraq today, when the fighting was already lower. One of the things that enables civil conflicts to get over is when a critical mass of people who still have guns decide that they've got more to gain from politics than bullets. And when these things are first underway, and you have a lot of people who think they got more to gain from bullets than politics, it's harder for a military intervention to be effective at any numbers. But it shows you what a great challenge our men and women in uniform have faced over there compared to Bosnia, relatively modest numbers going in terms of the cycle of the conflict at an earlier period, i.e. at the beginning, because that's how it exploded. So I got there as quick as I could. I wish we could have gone sooner. I think I did the right thing not to go in without NATO support. I think having the NATO support and then immediately after the UN support and the Russian involvement is what has made it work as it did. I feel the same way about Kosovo. That's the first answer. Second answer is, who had more influence on me than anybody else? What I knew of my own direct knowledge of the slaughter of the innocents and what Milosevic was doing through Karadzic, Mladic, and the other Bosnian Serbs to try to stir up all this ethnic and religious hatred. It was nothing but a power grab. They didn't, in Sarajevo, people lived together, the Bosnian Serbs, the Croatian Catholics, and the Bosnian Muslims. They lived together more or less as friends for 500 years. It was a power grab. And I knew that, and I went to bed every night for 3 years feeling terrible that we hadn't stopped the killing. So that had more influence on me than any other political leader. Fourth, did the NATO plan have any influence on it? It did, in the sense that I knew we had a framework and a plan for NATO action, and I figured that if we just kept pushing, sooner or later they'd all do it. But in '93, we got stiffed to do what we wanted to do in '95. By the time '95 rolled around and you'd had shells in the Sarajevo marketplace and the innocents dying by the thousands, the opposition cratered, we went in, and you see the result. That's a heck of a good question.
Yes. Let's try one up here.
Thank you for coming, Mr. President. In reference to citizen action in the local, national, and global community, could you share your thoughts on service programs such as AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, or Teach for America?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I love them all. I strongly supported Teach for America. We began to expand the Peace Corps again when I was president, and we established AmeriCorps, which now has had about 500,000 young people serve in their communities for a year or two, earn some money to go to college, and do a wide variety of things for people with all ages, everything from tutoring programs and senior programs to dealing with natural disasters. We have The biggest AmeriCorps program is something called City Year, which is in 13 cities in America and in South Africa. And since I left office, I've helped start 3 of those programs, one in New Orleans, one in Little Rock, and one in Johannesburg. So I still keep in touch with AmeriCorps. It's one of the things that we did when I was president that I am most proud of. So I believe that for a young person who can do so, to spend a year doing something like that, it normally changes the young man or woman's life for the better, and it gives them an exposure to a whole different set of life challenges and the sense that a lot of these problems can be solved that they might not have otherwise had. It makes our country a better place. I love them. I wish AmeriCorps were 2 or 3 times as big as it is. Yeah,
Mr. President, thank you for coming to Manhattan. My name is Karen Truitt, and I'm a special ed teacher at Fort Riley Middle School who's dealing with the stress of AYP right now because we start state assessment next week. What do you think of the current policy on No Child Left Behind and high-stakes testing, especially for students with special needs?
Well, first of all, I think the special needs kids, there needs to be a simple system for not counting them into the averages and dealing with them as they are. And if that doesn't exist, I'm surprised. I thought that's the way it worked. But I have as I so often do, I have a position that pleases nobody on this issue, but I think it's the right one, so I'd like to tell you. I'm not against testing and accountability. But here's my problem with No Child Left Behind, as compared with what I tried to do and couldn't pass through the Congress. I think No Child Behind there are too many tests, and I think that they are, and the focus is not, the remedy is, cutting back on the federal money, when I think the remedy should be identifying new leadership or new practices on a school basis. And I think that the tests they invite the worst of all worlds. They invite the teachers to teach the test, to worry sick, to spend all their time doing it, and then the state gets to decide what's a good score or not, or even in some cases what tests to take. So it might not mean anything, except when it's all said and done, you spend all your time spinning your wheels. I would prefer, what I proposed when I was president, is that we use a totally non-political group like the National Assessment of Education Progress, or a group called NAGB, which is totally non-political. There's Republican and Democratic governors on it. It sets standards. And give a test, let's say, at the 4th, 8th, and 11th grade only. And then have it be mean something. If you can get enough information on an individual student, use that to get the student's performance up. And if schools are doing worse as schools as they should, use that to get better training programs for better principals and better performance. Look, we got all these people from the military here. Let me just tell you what my great frustration about public education is. I spent 12 years as a governor before I was president for 8 years. In those 12 years, I was president of the Southern Regional Education Board, the Education Commission of the states, the National Governors Association, and I'd be very surprised if any governor spent as much time in classrooms as I spent. And I spent quite a bit of time as president. And the thing that drives me nuts about education, as compared with all other problems that I can think about, is every single challenge in American education has been met by somebody somewhere. And that makes it worse. Less than a mile from my office in Harlem, there is the Frederick Douglass Academy, a public high school. It's a high school of choice. You have to choose to go there, but there's no academic screening, there's no income screening, there's no nothing. You just got to agree to follow the rules, right? In the Frederick Douglass High School in Harlem, which is almost 100% minority, Hispanic and African American, the students have virtually no dropout rate. Over 90% of them go on to college. Over 90% of them graduate from college on time. They take the New York Regents exam, a hard exam that 11th graders have to take. Their test scores are above, not the New York City average, the New York State average. Now, that's great. When you said that, everybody says, oh, isn't that wonderful? But my question is this: how come within 2 miles there are 3 other high schools that are still in the tank on the test scores and the performance, where the dropout rate is higher and the kids don't go on to college, and when they do, they don't often stay and succeed? Why is it that we have all these success stories and we cannot replicate success? If the military worked that way, we could never send a unit into the field. The whole premise of what these people do is that leadership can be taught, procedures can be implemented, excellence can be replicated over and over and over and over again. That's the whole premise of it. Now, are some generals always going to be better than others? Yes. Are some, company commanders always going to be better than others? Yes. Will some people shoot better than others? Yes. Will some people fight better at close quarters than others? Yes. But the idea that we can replicate excellence to a very high level so that we can have predictable performance is what is at the heart of, got all these people sitting up here, what they do. The replication of excellence. That's the problem in public education. And I do not believe that I don't have any problem with testing, any problem with accountability. I do not believe the current Leave No Child Behind system replicates excellence. That's what we need to do.
One more question, please.
Welcome to Kansas, Mr. President. Are we on the brink of Armageddon, with so many nations focused on nuclear armament without concern for the welfare of their citizens, and with a lack of, there's just widespread civil unrest across this country? What would you do if you were in the Oval Office to subdue the civil unrest that's so widespread?
Well, first of all, I try to avoid the buildup of nuclear weapons. I think that I'll answer the second question, but I think that it's very important that we get back into the nuclear nonproliferation business. Now, it's a big debate I have there's a big debate within President Bush's administration about this, about whether, in effect, the genie is out of the bottle. And therefore, the only thing that makes sense is to set up these missile defense systems. The one that gets all the press is that we don't know whether it'll work, is the one, with the towers and sensors in Alaska and all that. But we have theater missile defense systems designed to shoot missiles down at an earlier point before they can get going, and we've tested them with some success. But until the last few years, our whole goal was to try to reduce the stockpiles of nuclear and, by the way, chemical and biological materials and nuclear weapons. And since it is also possible to make a so-called nuclear dirty bomb, if you get enough fissile material, you can put it in the bomb Timothy McVeigh used, for example, to blow up the Murrah building in Oklahoma City and exponentially increase its power. So the first thing I would say to you is there will always be people in the world that want to do bad things to other people, and what we need to do is to at least constrain the choices they have for inflicting harm and death. And so I'd like to see us get back in that business. And I think I believe that we have to do much more to try to find out in advance, both in a kind of a law enforcement way, but also in a much more affirmative way, what the sources of civil discord are in places with highly diverse populations to try to head them off. The British, for example, have started after we had all the homegrown terrorist actions, they have started both trying to do a better job of law enforcement, that is, fingering people that are going to do something like this and cutting them off in a law enforcement way, and also breaking the psychology that produces such thinking early on in the schools, in the neighborhoods, on the streets. They're really trying to figure out how it was possible for these people to grow up around all their neighbors, go to work with all their friends, go to school with all their friends, and have all the people that weren't in their religious and social groups just clueless about where they really were. And I don't think there are any easy answers here. I will say this, and I feel this way about the controversies the United States has generated over our treatment of non-combatants. Whenever there is a threat, an existential threat to the security of any group, it becomes legitimate in people's eyes to do things that didn't used to be legitimate to do. Well, I'll give you just a little easy answer. When we started having all these airline hijackings 30 years ago, all of a sudden, I was in the first generation to walk through airport metal detectors. And a lot of people raised holy you-know-what about it. It was uncomfortable, and I used to wear a lot of cowboy buckles. I mean, I'd have to go through those metals. One of them I went through 5 times. I just kept on taking things off. Finally, I thought I was going to be arrested for indecent exposure, so I could get through the airport metal detector. But you know what? Everybody liked it because the chances of surviving something going off in an airplane were quite small. So we were only too happy to give up a little measure of our freedom to ensure our security in the air. Now, every one of these things, every provision of the Patriot Act, everything, you have to be asking that. We need to do things that will make us more secure, but we don't want to do things that will fundamentally compromise the character of our country or the future of our children. It did not compromise my daughter's and her generation's fundamental freedom for us to have to be clean before we got on an airplane. And just think, it worked for 20 years. It took 20 plus years before somebody came up with this idea of making a bomb out of something that looked like baby formula. So you should all thank your lucky stars for the airport metal detectors, right? But when somebody else comes up with some other incursion on what is otherwise our liberty, you have to ask yourself every time, will this save lives, and what is the price of it? Will it in any way compromise the fundamental character of our country or the future of our children? There is no simple answer here, but you have to ask that's what I tried to say in my bigger lecture. Sometimes the best you can hope for in a new world is to ask the right questions. If you keep asking the right questions, eventually you get to the right answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Bill Clinton, and thanks to all of our soldiers from Fort Leavenworth and Fort Riley. God bless you all. Thank you for coming. Thank you.